Welcome back to Digesting Black History with 365 Podcast with your host, Marvin Glenn, and my host, Gwen Moore. We're so thankful that you guys took time out this afternoon to spend time with us to learn about Black history, because Black history is our history, and Black history is the world's history. I want to thank you so much for being here because I am truly, truly elated. But this particular episode is very impactful. We have Dr. Gerald Horne with us this afternoon. And want to tell you guys, get out your notebooks, get ready to prepare yourselves for a history lesson, because I truly feel that we at this point in time in our lives need to know about our history, because we will repeat our history if we don't know our history. So I have to tell you guys, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digesting Black History 365 Podcast. So, good afternoon, Dr. Gerald Horne. I have to tell you, sir, I have been waiting for this particular episode for weeks. I know you probably got tired of me doing all the emailing and everything like that, but here we are. And I'm so thankful that you are here with us today. Could you give us just a little bit of your backstory so we can just elate our viewers on who you are?
Well, thank you for inviting me. I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. My parents have roots in Mississippi. I graduated from Beaumont High School and then went to university and law school and graduate school in history. And now I'm a professor in Texas. And actually, to be frank with you, I spend most of my time nowadays traveling, researching, and writing.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Now, with some of the things you have written, and like we say, it's about Black history, what has been some of the things that have been, as you say, challenging and rewarding to you as a historian?
Well, rewarding is a much easier question to answer. I recall some years ago, I did this book on the South Seas. That is to say, the people we refer to as Melanesian. They look like yourself and myself, but they are indigenous to the South Seas. I'm thinking of the people of Fiji, for example, where I traveled, the indigenous people of the islands surrounding Fiji. And it was very rewarding to travel there to do research, because I was telling a story that's now embodied in a book called The White Pacific about how U.S. slave traders after the U.S. Civil War, post-1865, decided, like Keith Sweat, to try to make it last forever. So they went out to Melanesia to restart and reignite the slave trade. And it was very rewarding to try to recover and recuperate that history that had been forgotten. Now, challenges, they are many. One challenge is to try to do research in languages of which I have an imperfect understanding, to put it mildly. That's a real challenge, but you do what you got to do. I would say that's the main challenge, because I haven't had that much of a challenge in terms of coming up with ideas for books, and then doing the research, and then organizing the notes to write the book.
Well, let me. I know you're on a research trip right now. So,
That's right.
So what are you researching? What are you researching now? What's your current project?
So I'm in Berkeley right now, Berkeley, California, where I once attended law school. And so I have this project entitled Armed Struggle, ? Panthers, Communists, and Black Nationalism in Southern California through the 1960s. So right now, and starting tomorrow, I'll be looking at the papers of Eldridge Cleaver. I don't know if you recall Eldridge Cleaver, the late leader of the Black Panther Party. He left his archive to UC Berkeley. And Eldridge was quite a character, I must say. Quite a character. I mean, on Friday, for example, at the archive, I was reading a letter that his spouse, then spouse, Kathleen Cleaver, sent to him. It's an official document because she says it's from one Panther to another Panther. But she was complaining because he was beating her. He was physically assaulting her. I mean, spousal abuse, to put it euphemistically. And it was quite disturbing to read. I don't know if you recall these, after Eldridge tried to, he got into hot water with the US authorities, and then he fled to Algeria and lived in Algeria for a number of years. And then he was trying to get back to the United States. And so he decided to change his whole orientation. He eventually tried to join the Church of Latter-day Saints, meaning the Mormons, And he also, during this period, he became a clothes designer. I don't know if you've seen his pants called the Cleavers.
I have not.
No.
Well, they have a cod piece that accentuated the male genitalia, shall we say, as you walk down the street with these pants on. Eldridge was quite a character. And so I don't know if I'll include that in the book, but it is an example of the depths to which some will sink when Uncle Sam puts you under pressure. Now, that's one book I'm working on, but then I'm working on another book on Northeast Africa that includes the relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia. I could go into detail if you're interested. I'm working on a book on slavery in Washington, D.C. And by the way, my next book will be out in a few weeks. It's on Washington, D.C. during the 20th century in the context of racism and radicalism. And then I'm working on a book on Southeast Asia, which I've probably done about 3% of the research.
So the book on...
Can I ask you some information about the book that you're doing in Washington? This a little...
Oh, I see. So the book on Washington, it'll be out in a few weeks. The title is Revolting Capital. Obviously, it has a triple meaning. Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. So Washington is the capital of this white supremacist state, but for decades it's had a Black majority. And that's led to a certain contradiction and certain tensions. And so part of what I'm showing, or trying to show, is that because Washington had this sizable Black population, and it was the center of diplomats, foreign diplomats from all over the world. Obviously, they established their residences and legations in Washington. And so as Caribbean nations like Jamaica, Barbados, et cetera, African nations like Nigeria, Angola, for example, began to establish a presence in Washington, they're oftentimes mistaken, believe it or not, for Black Americans, which means that they're treated like Black Americans, which means that they're treated terribly. And that's no way to win friends and influence people in the international community. So that creates a dynamic whereby the United States has to sort of lessen, to a degree, the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow visited upon Black Americans, because they couldn't distinguish Black Americans from Nigerians, for example. Surprise, surprise. Now, in my book on Kenya, which came out a few years ago, I pointed out that the way they tried to deal with that at one point was to have a lapel button that African diplomats could wear so that they could visit restaurants and enter hotels without being harassed or getting hit in the head. But that didn't work very well because, Black Americans are very creative and inventive, and they could manufacture and counterfeit the button. As a matter of fact, you had cases of Black Americans dressing up in so-called West African garb, in adopting accents in going into hotels and restaurants so that they can serve. So it was becoming a sort of mess. So I guess Uncle Sam at a certain point just threw up his hands and said, fine, we're going to have to lift the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow because we can't really distinguish between these Black Americans and these Africans. And so that's one of the stories I tell in this book. Look for it in a few weeks.
Will do.
That's interesting about how the United States trying to win the hearts and minds of developing nations and the impact that had on segregation here. And I'm not sure that many African Americans realize that they can owe the lessening of Jim Crow to these African diplomats and trying to win the hearts and minds of these developing nations at a time in the Cold War.
Well, for sure. And I think that's still operative. I was doing actually a podcast yesterday, and one of the points that I was making, that there's a sort of a contradiction in the Black American discourse. What I mean is, on the one hand, many Black Americans, they feel that the majority with whom we share this country, speaking of the Euro-American majority, that for the most part, they're relentlessly racist. Okay, fine. So you would think that would mean that Black Americans would then look overseas for allies, for example, which is what was done historically. And as I've tried to point out in my own work, I argued in my book on the Haitian Revolution that the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, had a catalytic impact on the dissolution of slavery on these shores. And so historically, external events, global events, have helped our struggle. But somehow, despite this opinion, this rampant opinion that white supremacy is relentless, the next step has not been taken, which is appeal to the United Nations, for example. Now, there has been some of that. I recall that the family of slain slain teenager Michael Brown. Ferguson, excuse me. Shame on me, Ferguson, Missouri. That they traveled to Geneva to the United Nations Human Rights Council. But that kind of effort has been intermittent and sporadic. It hasn't been consistent. It hasn't been organized through certain channels, organizational channels. And so it hasn't gotten this kind of impetus that it so desperately needs.
I know William Patterson, wants to take that case to the United Nations, recharge genocide. So there have been attempts.
Oh, of course, there have been attempts for sure. And I guess what happened to William Patterson has been an example that has deterred many from following in his footsteps, because of course he wound up serving a prison term. And given our origins fighting back against slavery, I think that there is an ethos amongst Black Americans to, as in the jargon of the streets, to always try to sell wolf tickets, to act like we're always on the offensive, never retreating. But since we haven't taken the logical next step, which is going to the international community to help to alleviate the horrors to which we've been subjected, well, then it's apparent that some of our rhetoric is rather empty. But I think that the status quo is unsustainable, and that ultimately the next generation will feel compelled to take our cause and take our plight to the international community.
I have a question, and that question is this: what are your views of today's Black community structure, especially after what you just said? What do you think of today's structure of the Black community?
What do you mean by structure? You mean in terms of organizations?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's something missing, quite frankly. but it's understandable. I mean, my sister just mentioned William Patterson. He was a leader of the organization called the Civil Rights Congress, which actually had a branch in St. Louis that was quite active. I wrote a book about the Civil Rights Congress, and you can look up what I said about St. Louis. It was quite active. And there was a lawyer by the name of Witherspoon in St. Louis who worked hand in glove with William Patterson on various cases. But what happened is that they ran afoul of the U.S. authorities. The U.S. authorities have this habit of seeking to squash any organization that is seemingly effective with regard to fighting white supremacy and fighting back against Jim Crow and its legacy. And so by 1956, the Civil Rights Congress was driven out of existence. I already mentioned how William Patterson served a term in prison. His close comrade, Paul Robeson, who you may be familiar with, a leading activist, intellectual artist, once one of the brightest stars in the film industry, and a man who had great wealth, fame, and fortune, but was driven to near poverty because he joined with Patterson to file the petition at the United Nations charging the United States with genocide against Black Americans. So on the one hand, I think in terms of answering your question, that there are real deficits in terms of our organizational structure. Obviously, we need either our present organizations to broaden their agenda, and if they are unable to broaden their agenda, we need new organizations. But at the same time, we understand why it's difficult to broaden your agenda, because if you do, well, you may wind up in jail. and I don't know many people who want to spend time behind bars.
You mentioned that you said you feel like the next generation will take our case to the international community. Why do you feel that way?
Well, that was probably an overly optimistic statement.
Okay.
I don't have any evidence necessarily to back it up. It's more, as the saying goes, the wish being father of the thought. Perhaps if I say that this is going to happen, it'll give momentum to it happening. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the situation is getting very bad, as I'm sure you know, speaking from St. Louis. Oh, by the way, may I ask, you know, I read headlines at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch every day, but I don't go behind the paywall. And what's happening to Kim Gardner, this prosecutor in St. Louis County?
Yeah.
Seems like she's about to be driven. And I understand that Mayor Jones is turned against her. Is that accurate?
Well, well, she did criticize her,
Mm-hmm.
Which, you know, people take that as evidence that she is turning against her. I don't know, that might be going a little bit too far, but she did say she should really rethink her role as prosecuting attorney, and that she's lost the trust of the public. But there's been a lot of pressure on Kim Gardner. I mean, you know, she came in with a reform agenda. She had the police department against her. Certain police officers she refused to take cases from because she said that they were basically, she accused them of being corrupt. She's had a very fraught relationship with the police department here. And I think the whole power structure here is really anti-Kim Gardner. And they've just been waiting for an excuse to lower the boom. And I don't know if you were familiar with the case. This young man was out on bail. He had a monitoring device, and he violated that monitoring device, they said, over 50 times. They made it sound worse than it was, because sometimes the battery just died or something. But while he was out on bond, he was driving a car, speeding, ran a light or something, hit another car, This young volleyball player was in St. Louis for a tournament. She was 17 years old. She got pinned against the car in a wall, and she lost her legs, crushed her pelvis, damaged her kidney, and Kim Gardner is being blamed for that.
Oh.
So the Attorney General is told her that he wanted her to resign. He gave her a deadline, 12 p.m. Thursday.
It's like the Old West.
Mm-hmm. She refused. So he's taking legal action to have her removed from office.
Will she be removed, do you think?
He's taking legal action to try and have her removed from office.
What position is Cori Bush taking on all this?
She's supporting her.
Okay.
She's supporting Kim Gardner.
I think honestly it's going to be kind of hard to remove her because some of the things that the judge didn't do, that kind of has her in a good position of them not really coming at her like that for where she just got to just give up and walk away. Because a lot of things has been going on, just even with this case here, you got to think about all the other cases that have taken place, but it's bigger than these cases. I mean, it's horrible what happened to the young lady, but it's bigger than that because we haven't had this kind of Black power in the city of St. Louis in decades. I mean, or if ever. So what they're just doing right now is really just trying to stick it to her. But with her interview that she gave, she was strong, and she had some support, and I like that about her. So I'm not really into all the politics and everything like that, but I really try to keep my mind focused in on, hey, we got to be strong. We got to be strong, and we can't just give up just because somebody's throwing rocks at the window. Sometimes we got to look. Sometimes we got to go outside and say, hey, stop throwing at my window. Get away from my house.
Well, Missouri is a red state, a deep red state, ruby red, cherry red, whatever red you want to say. So
Valentine's red.
We're in trouble here in Missouri as far as Black people are concerned, or progressive whites for that matter.
Well, unfortunately, this going after progressive prosecutors is not unique to St. Louis. The progressive prosecutor in San Francisco, Chesa Boudin, was removed. You had similar attempts in Philadelphia. If Fani Willis in Fulton County, Atlanta, indicts Mr. Trump, which is not unlikely, I would urge her to beef up her security, for example. So I guess to come full circle, that shows that we're in the middle of a real struggle right now. And we're going to need all the help we can get. But as I said, I don't really see our organizations mobilizing the way they should.
And that's true, sir.
Since we're talking about contemporary issues, and I talked about the state of Missouri being a red state. Missouri is kind of following the lead of Ron DeSantis in Florida, trying to mandate the teaching of a sanitized version of U.S. history, in the guise of a Parents' Bill of Rights. So what about this movement?
Well, it's obviously demagogic. I mean, I saw the Woman King the other day, and with Viola Davis, for example, and you may recall, it's based upon a story concerning an armed brigade of African women who are seeking to resist the African slave trade. Now, of course, it's not a documentary, just like if you watch Shakespeare's Hamlet, that you should take it as a documentary about what royalty was enduring in Northwest Europe at a certain point. But the point that I took away that's relevant to this discussion is that Black people were resisting coming to North America, to put it mildly, because that was not our idea of the good life. And that conflicts with the uplifting narrative that Ron DeSantis and others like him would like to propel, which is that this is this great country without blemish, and everybody should be happy to be here. And DeSantis has said falsely, unlike like many historians, I should say, that the United States was actually the country that sort of invented the concept of the abolition of slavery, which is ridiculous because when the United States was born in 1776 and the years following, there were tens of thousands of enslaved Africans in that relatively small country. By 1860, 1861, on the verge of the US Civil War, when slavery was abolished, there were millions. So if this is an abolitionist country, well, I'd hate to see a country that was pro-slavery. If your population of enslaved is going from tens of thousands to millions. And so obviously what's happening is that there is this idea that Black people have fought against the formation of the United States of America, a point that I made in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, fought against the slaveholders' republic. For example, during the War of 1812, you saw the Africans, the Black people, they unite with the British to burn down the White House and send President Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets, one step ahead of the posse. Allied with the Native Americans, such as the Seminoles of Mr. DeSantis' Florida. There was a de facto merger between the two. In the book I just published on Texas just last year, I talk about the de facto merger between Black people and the Caddo, C-A-D-D-O, of Texas. Then in the 20th century, aligning with Mexican revolutionaries, as in the case of the boxer Jack Johnson, the precursor to Muhammad Ali as an activist pugilist, aligning with Tokyo. As I point out in my book, Facing the Rising Sun, St. Louis was actually the headquarters of pro-Tokyo sentiment amongst Black people. And in fact, in November 1942, as I point out, right across the river in East St. Louis, you had Black folks drilling with arms, awaiting a Japanese invasion of North America that they were going to join. But alas, they were arrested, indicted, convicted, and jailed. And then, of course, there was the historic relationship between Black Americans and socialist movements, as exemplified by the late, great Paul Robeson. And so all of these movements were seeking to transform the status quo. Ron DeSantis does not want that history taught because it might give people dangerous ideas that he would like to suppress. And so therefore, he's trying to circumscribe the teaching of advanced placement African-American studies. You have teachers in Florida who are cowering in their classrooms, afraid to tell the truth. You have school libraries being denuded of certain books that are deemed to be seditious and overly dangerous. And I'm afraid to say that this is only the beginning. Buckle your seatbelts, because if we don't do something, things will get much worse.
What do you suggest we do?
Well, I think Marvin Glenn had a good idea when he talked about organizational structure. That is to say, either these organizations need to expand their agenda, or we need to develop new organizations. I mean, for example, I think that the NAACP, which meets on an annual basis, should have a branch that is in touch with the diplomatic legations in Washington, with the diplomatic legations in New York, as the family of Michael Brown sought to do, to send emissaries to Geneva. But of course, the problem there is that, once again, people feel that if they take that route, they'll wind up in jail, which I must say is not an unrealistic possibility. And then if an organization like the NAACP, they're heavily dependent on corporate contributions, and many of their corporate donors would not be happy with the idea of them washing the United States dirty linen in Geneva, Switzerland, for example. But at the same time, you know, you may know that in my youth, in my callow youth, I once adopted the pose of a blues singer. We went to the Soviet Union, and some of the tunes that I was singing was one by the late bluesman, St. Louis Jimmy, called Going Down Slow. And basically, that's what we're facing right now. I guess we made the decision, we'll just go down slow. Because I assume that they think that if we take another route, we'll just go down fast. And so we might as well just go down slow.
Dr. Horne, do you feel that the students that you are teaching now and students that across the nation, do you think that they're like coming together would be impactful to this going down slow, making it slower? You think they could be the ones that can, be a big part of the the catalyst on, making that situation a little bit different?
Well, I hope so, because historically, as you know, youth have been in the forefront of movements. It's no accident that Malcolm was considered an elder when he was cut down at the age of 39. Martin Luther King was considered an elder when he was cut down at the age of 39. The shock troops of the movement that knocked down the walls of Jim Crow oftentimes were children as young as 7, 8, 9 years old. For example, in Birmingham and the demonstrations against Jim Crow. And there are reasons for that. Number one, youth oftentimes are easier to outrage. That is to say, they have not grown inured and accustomed to these horrors, and it's easier for them to sense that there's something terribly wrong. And oftentimes they're filled with energy, and filled with an energy that leads them to protest. And then, of course, they don't necessarily have jobs, because the elders oftentimes have jobs and fret that if they cross a certain line, they'll lose their job, which means losing their livelihood. And youth oftentimes do not have that particular issue. And then, of course, youth, their job right now, or as ever, has been to study. And oftentimes that leads them into uncovering stories of history and stories of inspiration that then drive them to protest. So that's why I made that comment a few moments ago, that I'm hoping that the youth of coming generations will pick up the mantle and seek to transform this society. As I said, I can't make a bet that will happen, but I'm optimistic that it will happen.
When you were criticizing DeSantis, you said, he was basically telling an untruth when he said that this was an abolitionist country. And I thought I detected a critique of your fellow historians.
Well, yeah, for sure. I just wrote a comment to a listserv. It's called Portside. They send out these messages on a regular basis. And one of the messages recently was from this historian who was praising Abraham Lincoln and talking about how Abraham Lincoln historically has been praised. And I pointed out in my response, well, what about Lerone Bennett, the late editor of Ebony magazine, who wrote an entire book called Forced into Glory, which was a critique of Lincoln. And I expanded upon that in my book, The Deepest South, where I pointed out the ongoing negotiations that Mr. Lincoln was engaged with the Brazilian government, because the idea was to send us all to Brazil. But the Brazilians said, thank you very much. We have enough Black people. We don't need yours. And he was dickering with all manner of countries to try to get rid of us, but nobody would take us. So that's one of the reasons why we're still here. And so after all those efforts failed, as I pointed out in this message to Portside, then Lincoln was poised to evolve, as the historians say in their cover-up. And I pointed out that perhaps it's no accident that successful or enlightening departures in history oftentimes are not coming from historians. They're coming from journalists like Lerone Bennett or journalists like Nicole Hannah-Jones in her 1619 project, not least because the kind of training that professional historians receive oftentimes leads them into an intellectual and political straitjacket. That is to say, that in order to survive, they oftentimes have to toe the line, and that towing the line oftentimes means regurgitating what has been said before, but putting a certain kind of gloss on it. And I should also say, I've been doing these interviews for this radio station in Los Angeles for the past few years. And I interview lots of scholars. And one of the things about these scholars is, number one, the number of scholars who turn me down, who don't want to be interviewed, even though I only serve up softball questions. And if they listen, all my interviews are online, and they would discover that. But A, the number of scholars that turn me down. B, the number of scholars who are so narrowly trained. That is to say, as I've been saying recently, it's almost as if they study the history of the fingernail. And don't ask me about the finger. Don't ask me about the hand, for example. And so, for example, there's a recent scholar who did it's a very interesting book. I read it. It's on slavery in Utah. And the Mormons. It's interesting. So, but she said, don't ask me about the Mormons and their racism, for example. Well, the book is about Mormons and slavery, but I can't ask about Mormons and white supremacy and Mormons and racism. I don't know if that's being narrowly trained or if it's just an evasion. But in any case, the historians have a lot of explaining to do. As you know, the number of, they're under assault right now by people like Governor DeSantis. The number of jobs are going down. You have college campuses that are in the midst of trying to abolish history departments. So it's just like I was saying about Patterson. On the one hand, we understand what he was doing had impact, but on the other hand, he went to jail. And so I guess with regard to the historians, on the one hand, they can have impact. On the other hand, they don't want to come under attack by Governor DeSantis and lose their jobs, for example. And I'm sure you must be thinking, well, don't many of these people have tenure? Well, yes, tenure meaning that they have a certain kind of job security. Mm-hmm. But apparently that's not enough. Tenure is not enough to get folks to move in a proper direction.
What would you like to see historians do? What kind of topics do you want them to, you think they should be exploring?
Well, some I should say quickly, some of this work is being done. For example, Robert Parkinson of SUNY Binghamton, his book on the founding of the United States is very interesting. It's very comprehensive. I would say the same for Woody Holton of the University of South Carolina. His book on the founding is very interesting. But those are exceptions. Those are black swans, so to speak. They're not the norm. With regard to Lincoln, I think one of the things I also pointed out in this message to Portside is that I don't think we can afford to talk about Lincoln without talking about how he presided over one of the most ghastly mass executions of indigenous in the history of this country, which is saying something. It takes place in Minnesota, circa 1862. And the US Civil War is really an accelerated stage in the dispossession of Native Americans. And one of the positive things, if I can be positive for us for a bit longer, is that there has been a kind of revival of Native American studies. I would like to see those involved in Black studies join this revival, not least because I think that some of our most important relationships have been with various Native American groupings. And I think that studying Native American history can be informative. I mean, it's like when I was writing my book on Texas, one of the things I kept wondering as I was writing paragraph after paragraph about genocide against Native Americans was, why didn't they make more appeals to the international community? Because they were clearly outnumbered in North America. And then secondly, there were attempts for them to band together. I mean, Tecumseh, the great indigenous warrior of North America, dies fighting alongside the British against the Yankees during the War of 1812. And speaking of which, we really need people in the United States to lift the blinders. I watched lots of documentaries. I recall watching this documentary about these Holocaust victims in Indiana and Terre Haute, if I'm not mistaken. And they were going around talking to these Euro-American teenagers about the Holocaust and the horrors of Central and Eastern Europe. And as I was watching that, I was thinking to myself, they're in a state called Indiana, after the Indians. They liquidated the indigenous population there. And somehow it doesn't occur to these people that there might be a linkage between the liquidation of folks in Central and Eastern Europe and the liquidation of the indigenous of Indiana. And that's the sort of blind spot that you oftentimes encounter with regard to the history of the United States. That is to say, taking for granted the extermination, and that was a term that they used in Texas, for example, the extermination of the indigenous population. So I would also like to see more Black scholars and Black studies scholars engage with Native American studies, because the field, you might have noticed that at least I noticed in Southern California, it's a small thing, but hopefully it augurs something bigger, that in email addresses, scholars will have, this is the unceded land of the Chumash, for example, speaking of Santa Barbara, or this is the unceded land of the Tongva, speaking of the area south of Santa Barbara. So in other words, there's a growing consciousness about the Native American struggle. And one of the things I found, interestingly enough, is that many of these US patriots, they will, as Governor DeSantis has shown, he will seek to challenge you if you talk about slavery and abolition. But how can anybody deny, well, actually Governor DeSantis denies this too, that this was land stolen from the Native Americans? I mean, he denies that somehow. I'm not sure how he does it, but he manages to do so.
Dr. Horne, I got a two-part question. Do you think is anybody that you taught can be a carbon copy of yourself?
Well, hopefully exceed what I've done. Let's hope. Because every generation has to build upon the work of previous generations. So let us hope that future generations will exceed and surpass whatever I've done. And I'm confident that can be done, because I was just, you were asking me about challenges, and I was talking about struggling through reading languages that I imperfectly understand. Well, that's something that can easily be improved upon by future generations, for example.
Yeah. I can definitely see that. The
Clearly.
second question is, what motivated you to get into history?
Well, part of it is the third person in this conversation. We grew up in the same household, and a couple things. I've mentioned this in a number of interviews. One is going to the St. Louis Public Library. I still I have not been afflicted with Alzheimer's yet, so I still remember my St. Louis Public Library card number, for example, because I used it so frequently. And secondly, there's a big article in the New York Times this morning about the child labor, which still exists in this country.
Yeah.
But I was a child laborer. I mean, I don't brag about it because I'm against child labor. I sold the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from an early age in the streets, getting robbed by these budding gangsters, for example. But at the same time, I began reading the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at an early age. Admittedly, just the sports pages and the comic strips. But it helped to engender a lifelong habit. First thing I'll do tomorrow morning is go out at 6 a.m. in Berkeley and engage in a paper chase until I find the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times of London. And then, of course, getting other newspapers mailed to me in my residence in Texas that will be shipped to me while I'm on the road. So I guess, at least in my case, it begins in the youth. Others might have a different story.
You mentioned those newspapers, the New York Times, Financial Times of London, Wall Street Journal. How would you describe those papers?
Well, I read them for many reasons. I read them because I want to know what they're telling other people, because that's where other people are getting their ideas from, whether they realize it or not. I mean, for those who watch CNN or MSNBC, basically a lot of their ideas for stories comes from the New York Times, basically. Yeah. They just poach issues and then present them in visual form. But then sometimes there's information as well. And obviously the New York Times is the most comprehensive of the mainstream newspapers, but obviously you can't necessarily trust everything you read in these papers, particularly about a contentious issue like Ukraine, for example, where they're all pro-war by their own admission. But I feel I have to read this sort of thing so that I can understand what other people are espousing. That's where they're getting their ideas from. So you might as well go right to the source.
You mentioned Ukraine, and I know I've heard you speak about Ukraine before.
Oh yeah.
And I don't want to. Well, just talk about the situation in Ukraine and how do you assess that, and what do you think the United States' involvement should be?
Well, I think we may be on the verge of World War III. It's a very dangerous perilous situation right now. The United States is now threatening China, saying that China will cross a red line if they supposedly provide lethal weapons to Russia. President Xi of China is due in Moscow in a few days. President Lukashenko of Belarus, one of Moscow's closest allies, will be in China on Tuesday. It's a very dangerous situation. The Russians have withdrawn from this nuclear accord with the United States. And interestingly enough, President Macron of France at the Munich Security Conference just a few days ago, although he made it clear that he's willing to go down with the ship with regard to this Ukraine misadventure, you can tell that he's rather bitter about how this whole venture has gone. And he intimated that the purpose of the venture was to have regime change in Moscow. Now, having regime change in Iraq or Libya is one thing. Having regime change in a nuclear armed country is quite another. And then, speaking of the press, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh, who's broken many stories on the front page of the New York Times, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, for example, during the war in Indochina. He suggested that the blowing up of the pipeline pumping natural gas from Russia to Germany was a U.S. venture. It could be considered an act of war. It certainly could be considered an act of criminality, and these demagogic Republicans in Congress, who supposedly are, some of them are against the war, at least that's what they tell us, including your homeboy, Josh Hawley, and yet there's no investigation of what could well be considered an act of war, which means they're asleep at the switch with regard to what might be the approaching footsteps of World War III. So irrespective of what one thinks about the Russian intervention in Ukraine, it seems to me that we can all unite on the basis of avoiding World War III, which would mean the extinction of all humanity. We can unite on the basis of using the recently enunciated Chinese peace plan as a basis for negotiations between the warring sides. Even President Zelensky of Ukraine did not speak ill of the Chinese peace plan. His patrons in Washington, of course, denounced it. But of course, his patrons in Washington, they would like to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian, for example, which would keep Russia tied down and would also perhaps even divert the big enchilada, which is the People's Republic of China. Because there's a lot of hysteria right now about the People's Republic of China. So in any case, I could go on, I'm on the record ad infinitum with regard to Ukraine. I mean, all you have to do is put my name in Ukraine into your search engine.
That's quite interesting what you spoke about, the Third World War.
Oh, please.
That's something there. Well, we're getting close to the end, but I do want to ask you this question. What were your influences living in Mill Creek and how it shaped your life and your careers and the things that made you Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, it's probably, my parents, my siblings, obviously. Those are direct influences. My late sister, Mary, who I followed her in terms of studying Spanish and then expanded that into studying Portuguese as well. And the stories of Mississippi, where my parents were born and raised, which was a real horror show. Those stories definitely influenced me. I vaguely recall, although it's hard to trust your memory when you're talking about things that happened before you were 10 years old. But I vaguely recall a discussion of the Emmett Till case. I'm sure you recall that case of the Black youth from Chicago who was lynched in Mississippi circa 1955. Yeah. I recall the case being discussed in my home, I think, of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the so-called atomic spies who were executed for supposedly leaking the secrets of the atomic bomb to Moscow. But what I recall is discussion of them leaving two little young children who were left without parents. Right. So Jackie, you recall discussion of that?
Absolutely. And I just want to say that our mother was very, very political. And we talked about these things around the dinner table and the stories that she told. I remember her talking about the Rosenberg case. I remember her talking about Emmett Till. I remember her talking about growing up in Mississippi. I remember her talking about Bilbo.
Oh yeah, I remember. Of course.
Tell people I know when I was a kid, I knew who Bilbo was. But that's the way she talked to us. She talked to us like we were not just little children, but like we were sentient beings that could understand these complex issues.
And plus,
so I give her a lot of credit.
There was always the soundtrack of KMOX radio, 11:20 a.m. And the soundtrack later, this is probably after I left home, of Onion Heart.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
And so, and then of course, baseball, everybody, I noticed from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, they still act like the Cardinals are one of the main reasons that people buy the newspaper. And of course, when you're talking about baseball, you're talking about a major capital investment. You're talking about racism. You're talking about desegregation, etc. There are many lessons to be gleaned from listening to all those stories over the years. The broadcasters, Jack Buck, Joe Garagiola, and Harry Carey, for example. So, I could go on in this vein, but as I've said, I've done a number of interviews, which you can find online, where I talk about this sort of thing.
Oh yeah, I've definitely been able to chime in with some of your interviews, and they've been beautiful. That's why, even with you saying my name, it just made me feel so good, because seeing you out there with somebody like seeing you on The Culture and seeing you on some other ones. You had one, it was like about 2.5 hours, and I watched it.
Oh my God.
I really got into that whole conversation. I forgot the gentleman's name, but it's like, man, I said, I cannot wait to get, I'm not in front of you, but I feel like I am, because it's like a history lesson. And all the things that I've been able to adapt to you and your teachings and the things that you said, I'm very impressed. I'm looking forward to you coming back. So please give us all your platforms and all the different things that we can go and look at, not only your books, but like where you may be next for as a speaking engagement or anything like that. Could you lend us that information?
Well, let's see. I can't think of where I'll be speaking next. I would have to look at my calendar. But in any case, this interview, once you send me the link, will be added to other interviews I've done that's on a Facebook page. And it's also part of the Activist News Network, which you can find on YouTube, for example.
Well, we definitely would be honored to be on that platform and to be able to lend what we're doing now, because it's all about Black history. We're trying to expand the minds of the young and the old, and we just trying to just be uplifting. But like I told Gwen, I said this would be symbolic, this episode, because some of the ones we've had before, they've been kind of like music and kind of like a few other interviews that still was history that was in St. Louis. But I think you gave us such a great history lesson, an international history lesson. So I really thank you for that.
Thank you for inviting me.
So
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And then once again, we want you to come back. So we will definitely try to get on your schedule and see whenever you can come back, and enlighten us some more on history, especially when you finish up some of them books.
Yeah, my DC book, maybe get my DC book and we can talk about that. It'll be out in a few weeks.
Okay, we'll definitely do that. So once again, Gwen, you want to close us out?
I just want to say that, I think people should understand that Gerald Horne, I'm not just saying this, full disclosure, he is my brother, but I'm not just saying it because he's my brother, but he's one of the leading historians in the country, nationally known, internationally known. And I've lost track of the number of books you've written, what, 40, maybe?
It's in the ballpark.
Well, yeah. And still, and you say you're working on what, 3 different books simultaneously now, 3 or 4?
Oh, yeah.
So I think this is someone who's making real contributions to the discipline of history, making real contributions to our understanding of history. So I just want to thank you for that.
Right on.
Yeah, and another thing too, I think that'll make it slower for most of the youth to start reading those books, because they can, take it to another level for us, how they can revolutionize some things and try to, get us a little bit more stronger, with knowledge.
Right on.
Yeah. So once again, thank you everybody for tuning in and being able to come aboard Digesting Black History 365 podcast with your host, Marvin Glenn, Gwen Moore, and our guest, Dr. Gerald Horne. So till next time, remember, your history is beautiful. Our history is loving, and our history is world renowned. Till next time, God bless.